Amen. I know yesterday we covered a lot of information, particularly if you're new to these subjects. I'm of the belief that everything can make sense if it's just graphed correctly. So what I want us to do is work through the lines that we have built over the last 18 months and combine them into one. So first of all, we have the Fourth Diadochi War. The Fourth Diadochi War and the history of Pyrrhus. You may remember that in the Fourth Diadochi War, that began that conflict, but then the history of Pyrrhus was in two parts, Macedonia and Italy. So for the context, the benefit of time, I'm just going to combine those alpha and omega histories of Pyrrhus into this one brief summary up the top line. So we'll put Pyrrhus's two history into one for this purpose. Then we have the history of World War II. Those two come together. And then we have the Third Diadochi War. And we have World War I. And those two came together. So we just want to plot the main points that we picked up from each one of these reform lines. Thank you. For the Fourth Diadochi War, what it taught us is that here it was Antigonus and Demetrius. We'll just call him the King of the North. After a 10-year history, the King of the North took a sphere of influence from the King of the South. That was the beginning history of that history of Pyrrhus, Fourth Diadochi War. After we see this taking of the sphere of influence, it skips quite a great deal of our history, of our reform line, and it goes straight to this point here, to where we line up with 2014. And at that point in time, we see an alliance coming together between the King of the North and the King of the South. In this history, it was Demetrius and Pyrrhus. So we have an alliance marked. We also have marked, because we are combining the two lines of Pyrrhus at the same time that they're coming into an alliance. You also see the King of the South launch an attack on what you could call a satellite state, a former satellite state. So we're just taking the key points. First of all, you see the King of the North takes sphere of influence from the King of the South, and then later on, the same time, they're coming into an alliance because we're combining the two lines. At the same point they're coming into an alliance, you also see this attack by the King of the South on a former satellite state. After this, you have this alliance realized. At the Battle of Ipsus, where you see the King of the North, supported by the King of the South, take on a threefold enemy. After you can mark the Battle of Ipsus, you could mark the Battle of Heraclea. After Heraclea, Asculum. After Asculum, Beneventum. The 4 battles: Ipsus, Heraclea, Ascul and Beneventum. At Beneventum you see the king of the south defeated, but not killed. He's going to progressively fall until he dies in the streets of Argos. And you can call this fall, depending on which one of those 2 lines you are studying, it has all the characteristics of a Cold War. The king of the south is defeated, but he isn't yet destroyed. It hasn't completely fallen. You see all the characteristics of a Cold War, and at the conclusion of that, at Argos, he dies. And we mark that as 272 BC. And we know that that is the history where we originally came to this entire series of studies. So that's the combination of the two Alpha and Omega histories of Pyrrhus. Then we come to the history of World War II. Again, you see that there has been a proxy war. There's a proxy war that comes to a conclusion, and you see that as it comes to a conclusion, this being the Spanish Civil War, that what led originally the training ground, practice ground for World War II, as fascism and communism fought over control of Spain. And then we find all of this history skipped, and then we come back to this history of 2014, and it's again King of the North plus the King of the South in an alliance. This is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So you have again an alliance, a pact between the King of the North and the King of the South. This comes to, they realise their purpose of this pact with the invasion of Poland, the beginning of World War II on the Western Front. And it was again, you see the King of the North being backed and supported in this by the King of the South, Hitler being supported by Stalin on the invasion of Poland as he took on a threefold enemy. That threefold enemy being France, Britain and Poland, who were in that history in an alliance of protection. You saw this pact between Hitler and Stalin dissolve temporarily in the history of 1940. It crumbles temporarily. They manage to tape it back up again for a little longer until everything dissolves, and they launch a full-on war on the Eastern Front with Operation Barbarossa. And now begins war on the Eastern Front of World War II. Operation Barbarossa beginning the Eastern Front. This continues from 1941 to 1945, and in 1945 you see the end of World War II. And remember, World War II is a history of failure. So in the history of failure, who loses? King of the North. And in the history of success, who loses? King of the South, because it's a history of success for the King of the North. So at the Battle of Panium, we know it's a victory for the King of the North. World War II being a history of failure, it was a defeat for the King of the North. But we have 1945 and victory in our history of the King of the North. Then we have what is marked as a Cold War, until 1989. That's the Fourth Diadochi War and World War II in their main conclusions. Then we can go to the history of the Third Diadochi War. So this is starting the second set of studies that were first presented in Germany. The Third Diadochi War begins with the Battle of Gabin. There's been this ongoing war between Eumenes and Antigonus. All comes to a conclusion at the Battle of Gabin. And in this battle, you see Eumenes, here representing the Soviet Union, he's overthrown, and it's from the inside. So he's overthrown by his own people from the inside because Antigonus has engaged in tactics more resembling I had the word and I lost it. He's gone in from the inside and used Eumenes' own people against him. In this, he has two important allies. One who fights directly with him, and one who is more of a moral support but has aided. Once he's defeated Eumenes, he starts to act more as a dictator. You see Python, one of his original two key allies, become more powerful. He feels threatened by this ally, former ally, so he attacks this ally and kills him. Now, throughout this history, from the death of Eumenes through the death of Python, what you start to see is a destruction in the relationship between Antigonus and his other ally Seleucus. So he's killed Python, one of his two allies, and then Seleucus has become nervous, and through this history he starts to no longer support Antigonus and then finally flee Babylon, surrendering it to Antigonus and taking sides with Ptolemy. Because of this behaviour of Antigonus, you see these three allies that are remaining, Seleucus being no longer a Diadochi, the word Diadochi, no longer having authority over that territory. He's let all of Babylon go to Antigonus. He's only a general for Ptolemy at this point in time. So what you have is three remaining Diadochis, Ptolemy, Lysimachus and Cassander, that come into an alliance at this point in time, and they send Antigonus an ultimatum. So there's three allies, send an ultimatum to Antigonus. They're telling him to give up some of his power that he's been collating during this time period. Antigonus refuses to acknowledge that ultimatum. Instead, he invades the sphere of influence of Ptolemy, the king of the south, here representing Russia. So we have Eumenes, a long drawn out war with Eumenes. Eumenes dies representing the Soviet Union. Through this time he starts to lose his two allies, Python and Seleucus, and now he has a new enemy in Ptolemy. He's fighting against all three, but it's he and Ptolemy that have had this long-standing conflict going back many years. So it's Ptolemy that he's first going to be antagonistic towards. So he invades the sphere of influence of Ptolemy. You see, through this history, he takes much of Ptolemy's sphere of influence, all through We skip this history, we come down to the point in time where he's gone, taken most of that sphere of influence. He leaves Demetrius in charge to hold that territory, and Demetrius decides to fight with Ptolemy against the advice of his general. So you have this battle known as the Battle of Gaza. Between Ptolemy and Demetrius, the king of the north and the king of the south. You have the defeat of the king of the north, and he fought against the advice of his generals. Then his father comes back to help him. They take back all of that territory of Ptolemy's, all of his sphere of influence, all up to the borders of Egypt. And he's poised to take Egypt himself when he becomes distracted by two things. In this history, Seleucus goes back and takes Babylon, and you have the Nabateans, the descendants of Ishmael. And the Nabateans are harassing his army. And because of these two troublesome entities, he goes into the peace of the dynasts, a peace treaty with Lysimachus, Cassander, and Ptolemy, but not with Seleucus, because he plans on fighting Seleucus for control of Babylon. So the history between these two wars, the Third and the Fourth Diadochi War, is another war over Babylon, known as the Babylonian War. It ends with the victory of Seleucus and the beginning of the Seleucid dynasty. And he allows Seleucus to maintain control of Babylon. We come to the history of World War I. We mark the beginning of World War I with the Bosnian crisis. So there's been, and I'll draw it again, you have Germany and Austria-Hungary, practically as two twins, or always closely united. Austria-Hungary particularly has a long-standing issue with a small country of Serbia. And surrounding Serbia are all these other states that are also Slav. So Serbia's Slav, and there's also many other Slav states or Slavs within these other territories, and the two we're discussing are Bosnia and also Herzegovina. So there's other Slav states, particularly Bosnia. Serbia wants to unite all of these under its own, united as one unified Slav territory, and there's a lot of fear about that within Austria-Hungary because it's becoming more and more weak, and if all of these Slav states unite, they know just how powerful that will be as a country. So they are antagonistic to every step Serbia takes towards independence, even down to manipulating and controlling the exports of Serbia. They try and keep a vice-like grip on Serbia to make sure it does not get out of control. So in the history of 1908, Austria-Hungary come in and annex Bosnia. And this upsets Serbia no end. And Russia supports Serbia. But in 2008, they're in too weak a condition because of internal revolution, because they've just lost a war with Japan, and they are not able, they have to tell Serbia, at this point in time, you're just going to have to cut your losses. We can't help you. Serbia on its own is not strong enough to challenge the might of Austria-Hungary, particularly when it is backed in everything by Germany. So in 1908, you have this Bosnian crisis. And it's a conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Serbia being backed by Russia, but too weak to respond. So, because of this crisis, Austria-Hungary and Serbia, Russia's too weak to respond. Russia feels humiliated. Bosnia feels humiliated. Out of this rises a terrorist organisation known as the Black Hand. These are Slav terrorists who are determined to harass Austria-Hungary wherever possible and wreak vengeance upon them because of the bullying and the annexation that has occurred. So they finally strike in the history of 1914, June 28, and it's the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The assassination of the Archduke, the final catalyst of World War I. Because these Slav terrorists assassinated the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, this Archduke was hated in Austria-Hungary. He was hated within his own family. Austria-Hungary did not mourn his loss. In fact, this Archduke was about the only politician within Austria-Hungary who was interested in caving to some of Serbia's demands. So this was a really bad idea of a terrorist attack. But Austria-Hungary didn't particularly care about his loss. He was not liked. But what they used this for was as an excuse that they'd already been looking for to make a list of demands to Serbia, and Austria-Hungary sends an ultimatum to Serbia, and they're essentially saying, give up your sovereignty. Austria-Hungary, if Serbia had have fulfilled this whole list of demands, Austria-Hungary would have even controlled the court system within Serbia. Serbia fulfills most of those except for that ultimate request to give up their sovereignty. And because they do not completely fulfill that request, Austria-Hungary invaded Serbia, beginning World War I on both the eastern and the western fronts. So World War I begins on both fronts with this invasion of Serbia. Russia quickly mobilises, France mobilises, and that Germany finds itself fighting a war that encompasses the whole of its borders. Germany is struggling throughout this war, so they finally come up with a plan that they're going to take a nationalistic revolutionary known as Vladimir Lenin, who's hiding out in Switzerland, put him in a sealed boxcar and transport him through Germany, through all of that territory, through the Eastern Front and into Russia. So they take Lenin, Germany takes Lenin and they send him into Russia, knowing that he will overthrow the government and make peace with Germany. And he succeeds in doing that on November 8 of 1917. He fulfills that desire for peace with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Remembering both World War I and World War II are histories of failure, which means you have to switch. In these last three battles, you switch the victor and the winner and the loser of those battles. So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a loss for the King of the South in this history. Transporting it to us, it will be a loss for the King of the North. So it's a loss. It's a peace treaty. There is now peace, but at great cost. At the cost of a great many people and resources. The war on the Western Front continues, though. Germany can no longer sustain that, and finally, on Armistice Day of 1918, there is peace on both fronts, but Germany does not know it has lost that war. It hasn't yet seen the terms of or the conditions of that peace until the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. And World War I did not officially end until that treaty was signed. Armistice Day was just that, an armistice. And an armistice just means you put down your weapons. It doesn't mean that the war has ended. This is why we speak about North and South Korea right now still being in a state of war. Because they got to this point, they got to the armistice, they never got to this point, which was the actual signing of peace terms. So the war between North and South Korea is in essence still going. It's never formally ended. So that wraps up the history of World War I. So I just want us to make sure that we're connecting correctly these histories. We see, first of all, Pyrrhus. In two parts. Then we see World War II. In its details, and then the Third Diadochi War, and then World War I. So if we're to bring them to our own time, what are we to see? If we were to make all of these applications down and combine them into the history of World War III. 1979 to 1989, we can mark a 10-year history and a proxy war. This is a 10-year Afghanistan proxy war that was fought between the Soviet Union and the United States. You see, at the end of that history, the King of the North takes the spheres of influence from the King of the South, and we know in the lines of Pyrrhus, it's giving special emphasis to the subject of Ukraine, which turns as a satellite state of the Soviet Union to an alliance with the West in the history of 1989 to 91. So we have a 10-year proxy war. We see Ukraine turn from the sphere of influence of the King of the North to the King of the South. We see that in this Cold War that's extended to 1989, the King of the North, the United States, has had two main allies. It's had the Mujahideen in Afghanistan that fought against the Soviet troops and was one of the main causes of the end of the Cold War, draining the resources and patience of the Soviet Union. And the second important ally was John Paul II in the Vatican. Those two supported the United States in the closing days of the Cold War. And when they finally come to destroying, taking down the Soviet Union, they do it from the inside. So we've applied these first three. We've seen 10 years, the King of the North, the United States takes Ukraine along with other spheres of influence, from the Soviet Union. as it dissolves. You have the proxy war marked. You have this war ending by the destruction of the Soviet Union from the inside, as the United States uses the Mujahideen and John Paul II to undermine the Soviet Union. At the same time, you see the Bosnian crisis. 89 to 91 is all of these things, but then there's a separate layer where there's also a conflict in the Middle East. That conflict between Iraq that led to this Gulf War Desert Storm of 90 and 91. These all started in 1989. In 1989, the relationship between Kuwait and Iraq disintegrates. Saddam Hussein starts threatening Kuwait with an invasion. We have marked here the United States. Serbia being Iraq, surrounded by the countries of the Middle East that it hopes to unite, particularly focusing on the taking over of Kuwait. It is supported by Russia, but Russia is too weak. It's just lost a war, it's going through internal revolution, and it cannot support Iraq. So you have the United States take Kuwait from Iraq in this history of the Gulf War. Iraq cannot respond, it does not have the power. Russia cannot support its ally. So this is the history of Kuwait and the Gulf War, where you see Iraq come into conflict with the United States over Kuwait and cannot be supported by Russia. That gives us the 1908 Bosnian crisis. Now, out of the 1908 Bosnia crisis, there arose a terrorist organisation. That terrorist organisation being Al-Qaeda. So 1989 to 96, all through this history you have the rise of Al-Qaeda. In the history of World War I, the rise of the Black Hand. Out of the history of the Third Diadochi War, Python starts to rise up and become more powerful, Python being one of the original allies of the King of the North. In this history, it's the Mujahideen, and the Mujahideen start to become more powerful. They change their name to the Taliban, and in 1996, they take over the government of Afghanistan. In 2001, this terrorist organisation, Al-Qaeda, launched a terrorist attack on the United States. I might keep it to it. Now, in 2001, there's two events that occurred in that year. First of all, you have the terrorist attack. That's Al-Qaeda. That had been rising up since this intervention of the United States within the Middle East. They struck at 9/11 as a pushback against American unilateralism that was announced in the September 11 speech of George Bush in 1990. But there's also this other war that doesn't sound like it is separate, but it is separate. You have the terrorist attack by Al-Qaeda, but where was Al-Qaeda supposed to be hiding out? Afghanistan. So the United States goes into Afghanistan and they overthrow the Taliban. So we only have the Third Diadochi War and World War I that comes into this part of the reform lines, which should make sense to you, because we know that the first and then the second have to combine. And if you look at the board, you can see how much more information World War I gives to the first part of our history and how much more information World War II gives to the second. So this is why when we did World War II, there's this big gap between 1989 and 2014. We had to take World War I to fill in this history of 89 to 2014. So it's only this Third Diadochi War and World War I parable story that are going to show us World War III in this history of 1996, 2001, Gulf War, Iraq War, etc. So we have the Third Diadochi War. Python becomes more powerful. He becomes a threat, or Antigonus sees him as a threat, so he has him killed. The Mujahideen turn into the Taliban. They become more powerful. The United States sees them as a threat. The Taliban did not attack the United States at September 11. They are separate to Al-Qaeda. But because they were known to protect terrorists within their borders, the United States sees them as a threat. They go into Afghanistan and they overthrow them. At the same time, you also see this terrorist attack by Al-Qaeda that formed out of this intervention within the Middle East. At the same time, you see the Black Hand launch an assassination. They formed out of the Bosnian crisis. So if you can see the combining of those two. So in 2001, the terrorist attack, what day was that? That's 9/11. The first battle of the Afghanistan War and the first victory for the United States in restraining radical Islam, what day was that? November 9. We talk a lot about 9/11 and the restraint of radical Islam. Was Islam actually restrained on September 11? I would suggest we forget about November 9 and that date in that history. The United States goes into Afghanistan. This is the first, I think it's called the Battle of Mazar-i-Sharif, and it's the first victory against the Taliban. They begin the work of overthrowing that government. But they're not content with this. The United States isn't content with this. You have three allies send an ultimatum to Antigonus. He's starting to act more and more as a dictator. Soon after 2001, the United States wants to invade Iraq, and George Bush is making it be known by his body language that you are, not just his body language, if you just take his words, you're either with us or you're against us. So if you go to the UN and you say you're either with us or you're against us, how does that go over? That goes over like unilateralism or dictatorship, because that's not how you speak to the UN. The UN decides on the right course of action, not the us, not the United States. So you have three allies these allies being those three allies being Britain, no, not Britain, that was Tony Blair's days and he was with the US. It was Germany, France, and Russia, underlying Russia. Those three came together and told the United States that if you invade Iraq, we will block it in the UN. Now Russia, it might sound like it's weak in this history, but remember, as weak as Russia was, when the UN was formed, Russia agreed to the formation of the UN only if it was allowed a veto vote in the UN Security Council. So Russia had the power to veto any bill that the United States had to have passed allowing a war in Iraq. So this ultimatum, it was essentially final. The UN would not allow a war in Iraq, and yet the United States invaded anyway. So in 2003, illegally, the United States invaded Iraq, which was the sphere of influence of the King of the South, of Russia. That's the first ultimatum. This is the three allies sending an ultimatum to Antigonus to stop acting like a dictator. Then you have a second ultimatum. This is the ultimatum of Austria-Hungary, representing the United States. They sent an ultimatum to Serbia. The United States sent an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, saying, "Give up your sovereignty or we will invade." Austria-Hungary said to Serbia, "Give up your sovereignty or we will invade." Neither party did that. That led to an invasion, which led to World War I in this history, World War III in ours. So we've taken the Third Diadochi War and World War I, and we've explained the history of the Gulf War through the rise of the Taliban, through the rise of Al-Qaeda, through the terrorist attack against Al-Qaeda, the Afghanistan War, the overthrowing of the Taliban, two ultimatums, one against the United States to stop acting like a dictator, one against Saddam Hussein, telling him to step down and leave the country, and then the conclusion of that, an illegal war in Iraq, an invasion of the sphere of influence of Russia. So that has been brought down into our time. Then we come to 2014 and we connect again with the story of World War II. We see an alliance between the King of the North and the King of the South. An alliance between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump that's going to lead to the 2016 election. So there's an alliance here. We can see that in both lines of World War II and the Fourth Diadochi War of Pyrrhus. At the same time as Russia and the United States, or Putin and Trump, are coming into alliance, you also have Russia invade a former satellite state. So up here it was Tarentum invaded, where did it invade? Those of you, Tarentum invaded Thuri. It invaded a former satellite state. In 2014 you have Russia invade a former satellite state. And if you remember that line from Pyrrhus, what did the invasion of Thuri lead to? That was the catalyst, and we're going to come back to this. That invasion of Thuri was the catalyst that led to these future battles of Heraclea, Asculum and Beneventum. So we want to draw that thread out from these structures and see 2014 as the cause and 2019 as the effect. So just keep that in mind for when we've finished this review. Through all of this history, we want to pick up the fact that this invasion of Thuri led to the war with Rome. This invasion of Ukraine led to the Vladimir Putin's war against the United States. We need to remember that point. Then we have the Battle of Ipsus, the 2016 election. Ipsus sees the King of the North being supported by the King of the South, taking on a threefold enemy. In this history, it's Donald Trump, supported by Vladimir Putin, taking on the three branches of the US government. What he would call the swamp or the establishment. They have a common enemy in the establishment of the US government. And Vladimir Putin is going to help Donald Trump come to power and overthrow that establishment. The Battle of Ipsus gives us that story with two separate witnesses. Poland gives us that story. So we have now three witnesses, and then we have World War I that shows us how he did that. So it was Germany that took Lenin from Switzerland and sent him through to Russia. It was Vladimir Putin that took Trump, helped him into the White House with the purpose of overthrowing the establishment or draining the swamp and going and making peace between the two nations. So Lenin promises that if he overthrows the Russian government and comes to power, he's going to end the war on the Eastern Front. He's going to make peace between Russia and Germany, King of the North, King of the South. What is Donald Trump saying in the 2016 election? Hillary Clinton can't make peace between Putin and the United States. I might end up being Putin's best friend. I'll make peace between the United States and Russia. The Cold War was so long ago, we need peace now. So Trump is promising peace. Lenin promised peace. In November 8 of 1917, Lenin overthrows the establishment. So November 8, 1917. November 8, 2016, Trump overthrows the establishment. Both did so with the help of the enemy of their country. We also have here marked the invasion of Poland, which shows us the beginning in the World War II. They mark the beginning of war on the Western Front from this point in time. 2018, we talk about the Battle of Heraclea, and we talk about September to December of 2018, where this alliance, this friendship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin crumbled. But then was patched up. It was fixed. Fixed after a private meeting shortly thereafter, which Donald Trump announced troop withdrawals from Syria and Afghanistan, and the release of some of the sanctions held against associates, oligarchs of Putin. 2019, the end of our dispensation, marking 2014 to 2019. 14, the cause, theory, Ukraine, 2019, the effect. We have the beginning of war here on the Eastern Front. If you go to the story of World War II, if you go to the story of World War I, it's the end of the war on the Eastern Front. So one story tells you that it's the beginning of war, and one tells you that it's the end of war. One says it's a battle, one says it's peace. And we will discuss those two concepts today and what that looks like. So World War II will tell you that the Eastern Front begins here. World War I will tell you that it ends. This peace came at a great cost for the United States, as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. You see this peace, again this Third Diadochi War, this peace that came at a great cost to the United States was done by Donald Trump without the advice of his generals. I should say against the advice of his generals. We understand that from 2019 to 2021, the United States will go to the borders. Here at Panium, we mark Islam from the Nabateans. This is the end of war on the Eastern and Western fronts. But we know that the King of the South is not here destroyed. This is the deadly wound. It'll lead to Sunday law, the death, the final formal end of World War III. And in this history, as you see the King of the South falling, you also see the rise of Seleucus. And we identified Seleucus from this history as the papacy. So if we were to think for a moment about what World War II and World War I bring us, if you're talking about war on the Eastern Front, or the Western Front in the history of World War I is going to tell you that the Eastern Front began in 2003 with the Iraq War, where this irreparable difference or disagreement was created between Putin and the West. Eastern Front beginning in 2003 and proceeding through to 2019. It'll mark the Western Front beginning in 2003 and mark it as proceeding all the way through to Panium. World War II will take 2019 and say here where the Eastern Front ends is actually the beginning, and it will take war on the Eastern Front through again to Panium. So we have this overlap of the Western Front. It's really dividing this Western Front war into two parts. This Western Front war, this civil war between the United States, between Democrats and Republicans over the Iraq War, is going to continue through all the way through to Panium. (2016), yes. In the history of World War I, these are World War I. In the history of World War II, it will take you from 2016. So we have this overlap of the Western Front. You'll see one story, World War I, that sees it from 2003 through, but there's another story, World War II. It's telling the story of this civil war as it relates to Donald Trump, and it's going to mark that in 2016. So that the two, you're really dividing the Western Front, or this civil war within the United States and the West, into two parts. One beginning with the Iraq War, which divided the world, divided the West internally, and then the election of Donald Trump, stage 2 of that process. The Eastern Front, World War I begins it in 2003 and says it ends at 2019, and World War II says it begins in 2019 and ends at Panium. So we're marking the two different parts of that. So just to give one last recap of this history of World War III. As we've combined everything together, the Soviet Union and the United States have been at war in the Cold War. The last 10 years of this Cold War is a 10-year proxy war in Afghanistan. The United States forms two alliances to win that Cold War, the Mujahideen and the Vatican, the papacy. They overthrow the Soviet Union by subterfuge from the inside. They take Ukraine, a satellite state of the Soviet Union, and turn its allegiance to the West as that Soviet Union dissolves. In this history, they take Iraq and Kuwait from the Soviet Union, particularly Kuwait, against the will of Iraq. This stirs up forces within the Middle East, and out of the Afghanistan war and this Gulf War comes the rise of Al-Qaeda and the rise of the Taliban. The Taliban take the government of Afghanistan. Then in 2001, Al-Qaeda strikes at 9/11 at a terrorist attack. November 9 of that same year, the United States is inside Afghanistan and they begin the overthrowing of the Taliban, which they accomplish quickly, overthrowing their former ally. What we haven't done is gone through this history and explain how, just as the alliance between Seleucus and Antigonus dissolved, so did the alliance between the Vatican and the United States dissolve pretty much immediately after 1989. And John Paul II and the United States were not friends in the history of 1989 until his death. They became quite antagonistic towards each other. So this alliance dissolved, and this one the United States wiped out. Then we have an ultimatum made in two parts, one by three allies against the United States, stop acting like a dictator, one by the United States against Iraq saying give up your sovereignty, fulfilling these two ultimatums. Then we have the United States invade Iraq, which is a sphere of influence of Russia. We have an alliance formed between these two mortal enemies, just as Hitler and Stalin hated each other. So this alliance between Trump and Putin, king of the north, king of the south. At the same time, Russia invades Ukraine, which is a former satellite state, as was Thuri. Then you have Russia decide they're going to end the sanctions, end this fighting over sphere of influence by taking down the United States from the inside, by changing its government. They do that by aiding the election of Donald Trump, and without their assistance, it's highly unlikely he would have been elected. They're taking on three branches of the US government or the establishment. 2018, their alliance begins to crumble, but they patch it up. 2019, we see on one story the end of this ongoing tension that has existed since 2003. Everything looks like peace. The King of the South has what he wants. It's come at a great loss to the United States. They've lost a great many spheres of influence. Donald Trump gave up those spheres of influence against the advice of his generals. At the same time, we know prophetically that at Rafah, this is also where a war begins between Trump and Putin, who in this history personally have been at peace. We understand the United States will push back against Russia, take back those spheres of influence at Panium, to the borders of Russia itself. We see Islam strike. Russia, Vladimir Putin, will continue to weaken until the formal end of the war at Sunday Law. So that is the conclusion of the combination of the Fourth Diadochi War, the history of Pyrrhus, World War II, Third Diadochi War, World War I, those being in the orders of which they opened up and were presented to the movement. It gives a completed picture to our history all the way from 1979 through to the Sunday Law. It gives a full and complete picture to World War III as we know it. We understand that what we're to watch for in this war is an information war, where the King of the North and the King of the South, in their direct confrontations, fight through information and cyber. It's an information war, but it's also proxy wars and wars for spheres of influence. That is what we have to watch for as we go through this history. It's the characteristic of war in our time. It has been since the invention of nuclear weapons. The last point before we'll close, we'll have a short break and then we'll come back and have another session through till lunch, is this history of 2014. The way it's marked up here with with Pyrrhus in Rome, and you see Thuri and Tarentum, that tension. It's particularly this history that I want to mark and show how it's not just a subject of World War III or King of the North, King of the South, but I think it's also one of the rules that we should abide by, how a one dispensation completes a story, and we'll discuss that when we come back, the 14 to 19 dispensation. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. I put all these things into your hands. I pray that through understanding prophecy, understanding how you teach through parables and these histories, we understand more of your character. Lord, it does feel as if we know you better for knowing how you operate, knowing how those counterfeits of you operate, Lord. We are grateful for your care for your people, that you would not leave us in ignorance at such a time as this. I pray, Lord, that you'll bless the remainder of our day and our meetings. In Jesus' name, amen.